The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of New Mexico territory, as Elias McKenna guided his weathered sorrel mare along the winding path beside the Rio Bravo. The water ran swift and cold from the mountain snowmelt, its surface catching the early light like scattered silver dollars thrown by some celestial gambler. He'd been riding since before dawn, checking the fence lines of the Double Bar Ranch where he'd worked for the past 3 years, ever since the war had ended and left him with nowhere else to go, and nothing but bitter memories of Gettysburg and Antietam. The leather of his saddle creaked rhythmically as his horse picked her way carefully along the rocky bank. Elias had named her Esperanza after the nearby town, though hope seemed a precious commodity in these harsh lands where Apache and white settlers eyed each other with mutual suspicion, and the railroad barons back east saw only dollar signs where others saw sacred ground. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound that cut through the morning air like a cavalry saber, a desperate splashing, then a cry that seemed to carry all the terror and desperation of a soul facing death. Elias spurred his horse toward the riverbank, his heart hammering against his ribs as he spotted the figure struggling against the merciless current. A young Apache woman, her long black hair streaming behind her like a war banner, as the water pulled her downstream toward the rocky rapids that had claimed more than one life over the years. Without a moment's hesitation, Elias plunged his horse into the icy current. The animal fought valiantly against the flow, her hooves scrambling for purchase on the slippery river stones as he reached out desperately. His calloused hand, scarred from years of ranch work and war, closed around the woman's slender wrist just as she began to slip beneath the surface, for what might have been the final time. With strength born of desperation and honed by years of hard labor, he hauled her up behind him on the saddle. Her body trembled violently with cold and shock, her doeskin dress heavy with river water, but she was alive. As they reached the safety of the bank, Elias noticed details that would later prove significant. The intricate beadwork on her dress that spoke of high status among her people, the silver ornaments in her hair that caught the morning light, and most notably, the absence of something around her neck, a pale line on her sun-darkened skin where a necklace should have been, as if something precious had been violently torn away. Her dark eyes, when they met his, held a mixture of gratitude and something else he couldn't quite read, a depth of intelligence and strength that challenged every stereotype he'd heard about Apache women. She studied his face as if memorizing every detail, from the scar that ran along his left cheek to the kindness in his blue eyes that had somehow survived the brutality of war. "You're safe now," he said, in the few Apache words he'd learned from an old scout named Running Bear, who'd worked briefly at the ranch. She nodded slowly, her gaze never leaving his face, and he saw recognition there, not of him personally, but of something in his character that she found worthy of trust. Then, without a word, she slipped away into the cottonwoods like morning mist, leaving Elias alone with questions he couldn't answer, and a feeling that his simple act of rescue had set something larger and more dangerous in motion than he could possibly imagine. Hey there, friend. If you're enjoying this tale of the Old West, I'd be mighty grateful if you'd subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. Your support means the world to us, and knowing where our stories are reaching helps us understand our community better. Now, let's continue with Elias's story, because what happened next would change not just his life, but the fate of everyone in the territory. What Elias didn't know, what he couldn't have known as he watched the mysterious woman disappear into the wilderness, was that he had just pulled Tazi, daughter of Ayana, from the Rio Bravo's deadly embrace. Ayana was one of the most respected leaders among the Mescalero Apache, a woman whose wisdom in council and courage in battle had earned her a place of honor that transcended the usual gender roles of her people. The necklace missing from Tazi's throat wasn't mere jewelry, though its beauty would have commanded a high price in any market from Santa Fe to San Francisco. It was a sacred ceremonial piece that had been passed down through 7 generations of her family, each bead and silver ornament carrying the prayers and memories of her ancestors. More than that, it was a map, the turquoise stones and silver inlay forming a coded representation of every water source, sacred site, and hidden trail in Apache territory. The theft had occurred just hours before, when Tazi had been returning from her morning prayers at the sacred spring that fed the Rio Bravo. 3 men had ambushed her, white men who moved with the confidence of those who believed themselves above the law. They had seen only the monetary value of the necklace, not understanding that they were stealing the accumulated geographical knowledge of centuries, information that could be used to systematically destroy the Apache way of life. In the Apache tradition, a life saved creates a bond deeper than debt. It creates responsibility that flows like water through the generations. Not ownership, as the white settlers often misunderstood in their crude attempts to comprehend Apache culture, but a sacred obligation of protection that binds both the saved and the saver in an unbreakable circle of mutual responsibility. As Tazi made her way back to her people through hidden paths known only to the Apache, she carried with her not just the memory of her rescue, but the knowledge that Elias McKenna had unknowingly stepped into a web of danger that stretched from the territorial capital all the way to the railroad boardrooms back east, where men in expensive suits made decisions about land they'd never seen and people they considered less than human. The Apache camp lay hidden in a box canyon 20 miles from the Rio Bravo, its location chosen for both defensibility and access to water. As Tazi approached, the sentries recognized her immediately and spread word of her return. By the time she reached the central fire, a crowd had gathered. Warriors, elders, women, and children, all eager to hear what had befallen the daughter of their leader. Ayanna emerged from her lodge, her weathered face showing the strain of a sleepless night spent wondering about her daughter's fate. When she saw Tazi alive and unharmed, relief flooded her features. But it was quickly replaced by concern as she noticed the missing necklace and read the story written in her daughter's eyes. The council that followed lasted through the afternoon, as Tazi recounted every detail of her ordeal: the ambush, the theft, her near drowning, and most importantly, the intervention of the white cowboy who had risked his own life to save hers. The elders listened with the patience of those who understood that every word might carry significance, their weathered faces grave as they considered the implications. Old Man Crow Feather, the eldest of the council and keeper of the ancient ways, spoke first. The sacred necklace was more than ornament, he said, his voice carrying the weight of his 90 winters. It held the water knowledge of our people, the secret paths our ancestors walked, the hidden springs that have sustained us through drought and war. In the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon against us. Ayanna nodded grimly. She had feared as much. And the white man who saved our daughter? He acted with honor when he could have ridden past, said Swift Horse, a war leader whose scars told the story of a dozen battles. But honor may not protect him from those who see him as a threat to their plans. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold that reminded the Apache of the sacred fires of their ancestors, a decision was reached. A small group of riders would approach the Double Bar Ranch, not as raiders or warriors, but as emissaries seeking to understand the character of the man who had saved Ayanna's daughter, and to warn him of the danger he now faced. Ayanna herself would lead the delegation, her presence commanding respect even from those who might otherwise react with hostility to the sight of Apache riders. With her road-swift horse, Crow Feather, despite his advanced age, and 3 other warriors chosen for their ability to remain calm in the face of provocation. The Double Bar Ranch sprawled across a valley that had once been Apache hunting grounds, its buildings constructed from timber cut from forests that had sheltered the ancestors of the current inhabitants for countless generations. The main house, built in the Spanish colonial style with thick adobe walls and a red tile roof, spoke of prosperity and permanence, while the bunkhouse and barn showed the practical concerns of men who worked the land for their living. As the Apache riders approached in the gathering dusk, nervous ranch hands watched from the bunkhouse windows, their hands never far from their weapons. The arrival of Apache at a white settlement was always cause for concern, but the formal nature of this delegation, the careful spacing of the riders, the ceremonial paint on their horses, the obvious leadership of the woman at their head, suggested something more significant than a casual visit. Elias emerged from the barn where he'd been tending to his horse, his hat in his hands, unsure of what to expect but determined to meet whatever came with dignity. He recognized the woman immediately. There was something in her bearing and the proud set of her shoulders and the intelligence in her dark eyes that marked her as the mother of the woman he'd pulled from the river. Ayanna studied him with eyes that seemed to see straight through to his soul, taking in his honest face, his work-worn hands, the way he stood without aggression despite being outnumbered. She saw something in him that reminded her of her own people, a connection to the land, a respect for life, and most importantly, the kind of quiet courage that acted without thought of reward or recognition. "You pulled my daughter from the water," she said in careful English, her voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of leadership. "This creates a bond between us, but it also creates danger for you." She gestured to Swifthorse, who stepped forward carrying a leather pouch decorated with the same intricate beadwork that had adorned Taziz's dress. From it, he withdrew several items that glinted in the dying light: glass beads that caught the last rays of the sun, a torn piece of fabric that looked like it had been ripped from a cavalry uniform, and a crumpled receipt bearing the official seal of the territorial government. "These were found near where Taziz was attacked," Ayana continued, her voice growing harder with each word. "The men who took her sacred necklace are not common thieves driven by desperation or hunger. They are connected to powerful people in your town, people who profit from selling our sacred objects to collectors back east, men who see our heritage as nothing more than curiosities to be bought and sold." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air settling over the valley. He'd heard rumors about such things in the saloons of Esperanza, whispered conversations that stopped when strangers approached, talk of certain influential men in town who seemed to have more money than their official positions should provide. There had been stories of Apache burial sites being disturbed, of sacred objects disappearing only to surface later in the private collections of wealthy Easterners who cared nothing for their spiritual significance. "What does this have to do with me?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer, and dreaded hearing it confirmed. "They saw you rescue her," Ayana replied, her words falling like stones into still water. "They know she would have told you about the theft, about what was taken and why it matters to our people. In their minds, you are now a threat to their operation, a witness who could expose their crimes and destroy their profitable business." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the ranch yard, hoofbeats that spoke of urgency and hostile intent. A group of riders emerged from the gathering dusk, their silhouettes dark against the star-filled sky. At their head rode Captain Morrison of the Territorial Cavalry, his uniform immaculate despite the dust of hard riding, his hand resting casually on the butt of his service revolver. Beside him rode Superintendent Walsh from the town council, a soft man whose expensive clothes and well-fed appearance spoke of corruption and easy living. Behind them came a half-dozen soldiers, their faces hard with the kind of casual brutality that came from years of viewing the Apache as less than human. "Evening, McKenna," Captain Morrison called out, his voice deceptively friendly, like a snake's hiss disguised as a greeting. "Heard you had some excitement by the river today. Thought we'd ride out and make sure everything was peaceful." The word peaceful carried a weight of threat that made Elias's hand inch toward his own weapon. He could feel the tension crackling in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm, could sense the Apache riders melting back into the shadows without actually seeing them move. Whatever game was being played here, he was now a piece on the board whether he wanted to be or not. "Just doing my job, Captain," Elias replied carefully, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "Checking fence lines, like always." Morrison's smile was cold as winter wind. "Of course, though I hear you've been making new friends. Interesting friends." His gaze swept the area where the Apache riders had been, noting their absence with the eye of an experienced soldier. "You know, McKenna, there are some folks in town who are concerned about your associations, worried that you might be getting ideas above your station." The threat was clear, delivered with the casual confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. But Morrison had made a crucial error. He had underestimated both the courage of the cowboy he was trying to intimidate and the tactical skill of the Apache warriors who watched from the darkness. The next morning brought no relief from the tension that had settled over the territory, like a heavy blanket woven from fear and suspicion. Word of the confrontation at the Double Bar Ranch had spread through the town of Esperanza, faster than a prairie fire driven by desert wind, and the reactions were as divided as the community itself had become over the years of uneasy coexistence with their Apache neighbors. In the whitewashed church on Main Street, its bell tower rising like an accusing finger toward the heavens, Reverend Blackwood pounded his pulpit with righteous fury that echoed off the wooden walls. His congregation, composed mainly of recent settlers from back east who had come west seeking opportunity and found only hardship, nodded and murmured their agreement as he declared that the Apache were planning an uprising, and that any white man who consorted with them was a traitor to his own race and to the cause of Christian civilization. "The savage cannot be trusted," Blackwood thundered, his face red with passion and conviction. "They are children of darkness, worshippers of heathen spirits, and they will use any weakness, any misguided sympathy, to destroy everything we have built in this wilderness. The man who saves an Apache today may find his own scalp decorating their lodges tomorrow. The congregation's amens rose like a chorus of condemnation, fear and prejudice feeding on each other like kindling on a flame. These were people who had lost friends and family to Apache raids in the early days of settlement, who had seen their dreams of prosperity challenged by a people who refused to simply disappear as the politicians back east had promised they would. Meanwhile, in the back rooms of the Copper Dollar Saloon, where the air was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of whiskey, a different kind of meeting was taking place. The saloon's owner, a shrewd man named Garrett, who asked no questions as long as the money was good, had cleared out the regular customers and posted guards at the doors. Captain Morrison sat across a felt-covered table from a well-dressed stranger who'd arrived on the morning train from Santa Fe, Baron Cornelius Ashford, a railroad magnate whose interests extended far beyond laying track across the Western territories. Ashford was a man who understood that true power came not from uniforms or titles, but from the ability to turn human suffering into profit. The stolen Apache necklace lay on the table between them, its turquoise and silver catching the lamplight and throwing blue-green reflections on the walls. To Morrison, it was simply valuable contraband. To Ashford, it represented something far more precious. Information that could be worth millions of dollars in railroad development and land speculation. "The piece is exquisite," Ashford murmured, turning the necklace over in his manicured hands with the reverence of a true collector. "My associates in New York will pay handsomely for authentic Apache ceremonial items. The Eastern elite have developed quite an appetite for what they call primitive art, though they have no understanding of its true significance." He paused, studying the intricate pattern of stones and metalwork, with the eye of a man who had spent years learning to read the hidden meanings in Native American artifacts. "But this is more than mere decoration, isn't it, Captain? These patterns, the way the turquoise is arranged, it's a map showing water sources throughout Apache territory." Morrison leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth like a cat contemplating a cornered mouse. "You have a good eye, Baron. With that information, your railroad can plan routes that will give you control of every major water source in the territory. The Apache will have no choice but to accept whatever terms you offer, or watch their people die of thirst." "Precisely," Ashford agreed, carefully wrapping the necklace in a silk cloth. "But this incident with the cowboy concerns me. We can't afford to have attention drawn to our operation, especially not now when we're so close to achieving our goals." Morrison's expression hardened. "Don't worry about McKenna. He's just one man, and not a particularly important one at that. If he becomes too much of a problem, well, accidents happen out here in the wilderness. Apache raids, wild animals, falls from horses. The frontier is a dangerous place for those who don't know their place." What they didn't know was that Tazi had been watching from the alley behind the saloon, her keen eyes taking in every detail of their meeting through a crack in the wooden wall. She'd learned to move like a shadow through the white man's world, invisible to those who saw only what they expected to see. A young Indian woman of no consequence, beneath their notice and therefore beneath their guard. The skills her grandmother had taught her, patience, observation, the ability to read the land and the people on it like a book written in a language older than words, served her well in this concrete and wood landscape that the whites had imposed upon the desert. She understood now that the theft of her necklace was part of something much larger and more sinister than simple greed. As the day wore on, and the sun climbed toward its merciless zenith, Elias found himself caught between two worlds, like a man standing on a narrow bridge over a raging river. The other ranch hands avoided him with the superstitious fear of men who believed that trouble was contagious, their easy camaraderie replaced by suspicious glances and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when he approached. Even his boss, Old Man Henderson, a decent man who'd built his ranch through honest work and fair dealing, seemed nervous around him. Henderson was too principled to fire Elias outright without cause, but the pressure from the town's influential citizens was mounting, and Elias could see the worry lines deepening around the old rancher's eyes. "Elias," Henderson said as they stood together watching the cattle graze in the afternoon heat, "I've been hearing things in town. Folks are saying you've gotten yourself mixed up with the Apache, that you're taking sides in something that's bigger than both of us." Elias turned to face his employer, seeing the genuine concern in the older man's weathered features. I pulled a drowning woman out of the river, Mr. Henderson. That's all I did. If that makes me guilty of something, then I guess I don't understand what we're supposed to stand for out here." Henderson sighed, removing his hat to wipe the sweat from his brow. "It's not about right and wrong anymore. Son, it's about survival. There are forces at work here that don't care about individual conscience or moral principles. They care about power and money, and they'll crush anyone who gets in their way." It was near sunset when Tazi appeared at the edge of the ranch property, materializing from the scrub brush and scattered boulders like a spirit of the desert itself. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who had learned to read the land's moods and move in harmony with them, her moccasined feet making no sound on the hard-packed earth as she approached the corral, where Elias was tending to his horse. The mare, Esperanza, nickered softly at Tazi's approach, showing none of the nervousness that horses usually displayed around strangers. Animals, Elias had learned, were often better judges of character than humans, and his horse's calm acceptance of the Apache woman told him something important about her nature. "They plan to move the children tonight," Tazi said without preamble, her English accented but clear, each word chosen with the precision of someone speaking in a language that was not her native tongue, but which she had mastered through necessity. "The train that comes through at midnight, it carries more than just the stolen sacred objects." Elias turned to face her fully, seeing the urgency in her dark eyes, the way her hands clenched and unclenched as if she were fighting to maintain her composure. "What children?" "Apache children, taken from families who live near the water sources the railroad wants to claim," she replied, her voice tight with controlled anger. "They call them interpreters in their official papers, cultural liaisons who will help facilitate peaceful relations between the railroad and the tribes. But they are hostages, insurance that our people will not fight when they come to take our land and poison our sacred places." The pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place in Elias's mind like the tumblers of a lock clicking open. The railroad needed water for their steam engines, massive quantities of it to keep their locomotives running across the desert. The Apache controlled the best springs and rivers in the territory, water sources that had sustained their people for countless generations and which they considered as sacred as any church or cathedral. By taking the children and selling the sacred objects, Morrison and his associates were systematically destroying the Apache's ability to resist. Without their children, the parents would be forced to cooperate. Without their sacred objects, the spiritual leaders would lose the tools they needed to maintain the cultural cohesion that made resistance possible. "Why are you telling me this?" Elias asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Tazi stepped closer, and he could see the pain in her eyes, the weight of responsibility she carried for her people's suffering. "Because when you pulled me from the water, you became part of this story. In my people's way, the one who saves a life becomes responsible for protecting it. But it works both ways. I am also responsible for protecting yours." She reached into a leather pouch at her side and withdrew a handful of items that caught the dying light. Glass beads like the ones Ayana had shown him. A piece of torn fabric that looked like it had been ripped from a cavalry uniform, and something new. A railway schedule with certain times circled in red ink. The paper creased and stained as if it had been carried for many miles. "I found these near the old mission ruins," she continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "The train stops there to take on water from the spring that feeds the Rio Bravo. It's where they load the children, away from the eyes of the town and the questions of anyone who might have a conscience. If we're going to stop them, it has to be tonight." Elias felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He could walk away, pretend he'd never seen Tazi in the river, never heard about the stolen children or the sacred necklace. He could keep his job, his simple life, his safety. He could remain just another cowboy in a territory full of men trying to make their way in a harsh land. But as he looked into her eyes, he knew that some choices, once presented, couldn't be unmade. Some lines, once crossed, changed a man forever. He thought of the children, innocent victims of adult greed and ambition, and he thought of the woman standing before him, who had trusted him with knowledge that could get them both killed. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, and with those words, sealed his fate. The old mission of San Miguel stood like a broken tooth against the star-filled sky, its adobe walls crumbling after decades of abandonment and neglect. Once it had been a place of worship and learning, where Spanish priests had tried to convert the Apache to Christianity, with varying degrees of success and failure. The irony was not lost on Tazi that it now served a darker purpose. a way station for human trafficking disguised as government business and wrapped in the flag of progress and civilization. The mission sat in a natural depression surrounded by low hills, its location chosen by the original builders for its access to the spring that bubbled up from deep underground. The Spanish had built their chapel over the spring, believing that they could sanctify the Apache's sacred water source by blessing it in the name of their Christian god. Now the railroad used that same spring to fill the water tanks of their locomotives, another layer of desecration piled upon the original sin. Elias and Tazi crouched behind a low wall that had once enclosed the mission's cemetery, watching as lanterns bobbed in the darkness around the mission grounds like fireflies dancing over a grave. The midnight train was still an hour away, but Morrison's men were already preparing for its arrival with the efficiency of a well-rehearsed operation. They'd brought wagons covered with canvas, and Elias could hear the soft crying of children from within, a sound that cut through his heart like a knife and filled him with a rage he hadn't felt since the war. These weren't enemy soldiers or armed combatants. They were innocents whose only crime was being born Apache in a territory where their very existence was seen as an obstacle to progress. "How many?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the night wind that sighed through the ruins. Tazi's eyes were hard as flint as she counted the guards, the wagons, the preparations being made for the train's arrival. 8 children, all between 7 and 12 years old. They were taken during the last full moon when their families were at the sacred ceremonies and the camps were less heavily guarded. She paused, her voice catching slightly as she continued. "My cousin's son is among them. Little Bear, only 9 winters old. He was learning the old songs from his grandfather when they took him. The plan they'd devised was simple but dangerous, requiring precise timing and no small amount of luck. While Elias created a distraction at the front of the mission, drawing the guards' attention and hopefully their numbers, Tazi would circle around to the back where the wagons were kept. Her knowledge of Apache stealth techniques and her small size would allow her to move unseen in ways that would be impossible for a larger person. They'd have only minutes before the train arrived and Morrison's full force would be brought to bear against them. After that, their only hope would be to disappear into the desert and pray that the Apache's knowledge of the land would give them an advantage over their pursuers. As they prepared to move, Tazi placed her hand on Elias's arm, her touch light but somehow conveying a weight of meaning that words couldn't express. "There's something you should know," she said quietly, her voice carrying across the years of her people's suffering. "The necklace they stole. It's not just ceremonial. It's a map carved in the silver and marked with turquoise. It shows the location of every water source in Apache territory, every sacred site, every hidden trail that our people have used for generations." Elias felt a chill of understanding that went deeper than the cold night air. This wasn't just about money or even about the children, though both were important enough to justify the risks they were taking. This was about the systematic destruction of an entire people's way of life, the theft of their most sacred knowledge to serve the greed of men who saw the land only as something to be exploited and consumed. "Then we get it back," he said simply, and in those words Tazi heard an echo of the determination that had driven her own people to resist for so many years against impossible odds. She smiled for the first time since he'd known her, and in that smile, he saw not just gratitude but respect, the recognition of a kindred spirit who understood that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. The attack began with the sound of breaking glass as Elias hurled a rock through one of the mission's remaining windows, the crash echoing off the adobe walls like a gunshot. Morrison's men rushed toward the sound with the trained responses of soldiers, their attention focused on the front of the building while Tazi slipped like smoke toward the wagons where the children were being held. But their plan had a flaw they hadn't anticipated, a variable they couldn't have accounted for in their desperate haste to act. Captain Morrison was too experienced a soldier, too cunning a tactician, to be completely fooled by a simple diversion. As his men investigated the disturbance, he remained by the wagons with 2 of his most trusted sergeants, his hand on his pistol, his eyes scanning the darkness with the patience of a predator who had learned to wait for his prey to reveal itself. When Tazi emerged from the shadows to cut the ropes binding the children, Morrison was ready for her. "Well, well," he drawled, drawing his weapon with the casual ease of a man who had killed before and felt no remorse about it. "The little Apache princess comes to play hero. How touching." The standoff lasted only seconds, but in those seconds everything changed. The children, recognizing Tazi despite their fear and confusion, began to move toward her with the instinctive trust that the young place in those they perceive as protectors. Morrison's finger tightened on the trigger, his face showing the cold satisfaction of a man about to eliminate a problem. Then Elias appeared behind Morrison like an avenging angel, his rifle trained on the captain's back, the barrel steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Let them go, Morrison," he called out, his voice carrying across the mission grounds with the authority of absolute conviction. "This ends here." Morrison laughed, a sound like breaking glass that seemed to echo off the mission walls and return as something even more sinister. "You think you can stop progress, McKenna? You think one cowboy and one squaw can stand against the forces of civilization? The railroad is coming whether you like it or not. These savages are standing in the way of destiny itself. Civilization?" Tazi's voice cut through the night air like a blade forged in the fires of righteous anger. "You steal children from their families and call it civilization? You desecrate sacred objects and call it progress? You poison the water and call it development?" The sound of the approaching train whistle echoed across the desert, a mournful wail that seemed to carry all the sorrow of the dying West, all the grief of a people being systematically destroyed in the name of progress and profit. In minutes, the locomotive would arrive, and with it, Baron Ashford and whatever reinforcements he'd brought from the territorial capital. It was then that the unexpected happened, something that would be talked about in both Apache camps and frontier saloons for generations to come. From the darkness around the mission came the sound of horses, dozens of them, and the Apache war cry that had struck fear into the hearts of their enemies for countless generations. But these weren't raiders come for revenge, weren't warriors seeking to settle old scores with blood and fire. They were families, parents and grandparents and siblings, aunts and uncles and cousins, come to reclaim their stolen children. The sight of them, proud and fierce and utterly unafraid, sent Morrison's men scrambling for cover behind the mission walls. Ayanna rode at their head, her face painted for war in the traditional patterns that spoke of protection and justice, her rifle gleaming in the moonlight like a silver snake. Behind her came the warriors of 3 different clans, united in their determination to protect their young, their differences set aside in the face of a common threat to everything they held sacred. "You wanted to see savages." "Captain?" Ayanna called out, her voice carrying clearly across the mission grounds with the authority of a leader who had earned her position through wisdom and courage. "Look around you. See how savages protect their children." The battle that followed was brief, but decisive, a clash between 2 different concepts of civilization that had been building toward this moment for years. Morrison's men, outnumbered and caught in the open, found themselves facing not the disorganized rabble they had expected, but a coordinated force of warriors who knew the land and fought with the desperate courage of parents protecting their young. The Apache had brought more than just weapons to this fight. They had brought knowledge, the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to survive in this harsh land. They knew every rock, every shadow, every way the wind could carry sound or scent. Against such advantages, Morrison's superior firepower meant little. As the train pulled into the mission station, its headlight cutting through the smoke and dust of the conflict like a single eye opening in the darkness, Baron Ashford found himself facing not a successful transfer of stolen goods and human cargo, but a united front of Apache and white settlers who'd had enough of his kind of progress. The locomotive's whistle shrieked again, but this time it sounded less like a herald of the future and more like the death cry of a dying age, the last gasp of those who believed that might made right, and that the strong had the natural right to prey upon the weak. The dawn that followed the confrontation at the mission brought changes that would ripple through the territory for years to come, transforming not just the immediate participants but the very nature of the relationship between the Apache and the white settlers who shared this harsh and beautiful land. Baron Ashford, faced with the evidence of his illegal activities and the testimony of the rescued children, found his carefully constructed empire beginning to crumble like adobe walls in a flash flood. The territorial government, suddenly eager to distance itself from the scandal that threatened to reach all the way to Washington, revoked his railroad charter and launched an investigation that would eventually expose a network of corruption stretching from local officials to federal bureaucrats. The stolen Apache artifacts, including Tazi's sacred necklace, were returned to their rightful owners in a ceremony that drew representatives from tribes across the Southwest. The necklace itself, when examined by Apache elders who understood its true significance, proved to contain even more information than anyone had realized. Not just the locations of water sources, but the seasonal patterns of game migration, the locations of medicinal plants, and the sacred sites where the Apache had conducted ceremonies for countless generations. Captain Morrison and Superintendent Walsh were arrested by federal marshals, who'd been investigating reports of corruption in the territorial administration. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Not just the testimony of the rescued children and the recovered artifacts, but financial records that showed payments from Eastern collectors and railroad interests that far exceeded their official salaries. But perhaps the most significant change was in the relationship between the town of Esperanza and the Apache communities that surrounded it. The rescue of the children had shown both sides that they had more in common than they'd realized: a love of family, a respect for the land, and a desire to build something lasting for future generations. The process wasn't easy or immediate. Years of mistrust and misunderstanding couldn't be erased overnight, and there were those on both sides who preferred the old ways of suspicion and hostility. But the foundation had been laid for something new, a partnership based on mutual respect rather than mutual fear. Elias found himself at the center of these changes, no longer just a drifting cowboy but a bridge between two worlds that had seemed irreconcilably different. The Apache had given him a new name in their ceremony of thanksgiving, Keeper of the Water's Path, recognizing not just his role in the rescue but his commitment to protecting the sacred springs and rivers that both peoples depended on. The name carried responsibilities as well as honor. As Keeper of the Water's Path, Elias became a mediator in disputes over water rights, a translator not just of languages but of cultural concepts that often had no direct equivalent from one society to another. He learned to see the land through Apache eyes, understanding that every spring and stream was not just a resource to be exploited, but a living entity with its own spirit and purpose. Old Man Henderson, recognizing the changing times and the value of having someone who could work with both communities, made Elias a partner in the ranch rather than just an employee. Together, they developed new approaches to cattle ranching that took into account Apache knowledge of seasonal patterns and sustainable land use, creating a model that other ranchers would eventually adopt throughout the territory. Tazi stood beside him as the sun rose over the desert on the morning after the ceremony, the recovered necklace once again around her throat, its turquoise and silver catching the morning light like captured pieces of sky and cloud. The bond that had been forged when he pulled her from the Rio Bravo had evolved into something deeper, not the debt of rescue and rescued, but the partnership of equals who'd chosen to stand together against injustice. "The water runs clear again," she said, using the Apache phrase for when balance had been restored to the world, when the natural order had been reestablished after a period of chaos and disruption. Elias nodded, understanding now that his simple act of pulling a drowning woman from a river had been the first step on a journey that had changed not just his life, but the lives of everyone around him. He'd learned that sometimes the right choice isn't the easy one, and that true strength comes not from standing alone but from knowing when to stand with others. The lessons he'd learned went deeper than politics or cultural differences. He'd discovered that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. That honor wasn't about following rules but about doing what was right even when it cost you everything you thought you wanted. As the morning breeze carried the scent of sage and new grass across the desert, Elias and Tazi walked together toward the town, where Apache and white settlers were already beginning the hard work of building a future based on mutual respect rather than mutual fear. Behind them, the Rio Bravo flowed on as it had for countless generations, carrying with it the promise of renewal and the hope of peace. The story of the cowboy who saved an Apache woman at dawn and found his true name by sunset had become legend, told around campfires and in saloons throughout the territory. But the real story, the story of two peoples learning to share the land and protect what was sacred to both, was just beginning. Written not in words but in the daily choices of ordinary people who had decided that understanding was stronger than hatred, that cooperation was more powerful than conflict. In the years that followed, the mission of San Miguel was rebuilt, not as a symbol of one culture's dominance over another, but as a meeting place where Apache and white settlers could come together to resolve disputes, share knowledge, and plan for a future that honored the best traditions of both peoples. The spring that bubbled up from deep underground continued to flow, its waters nourishing not just the physical needs of those who drank from it, but the spiritual needs of a community learning to see itself as one people sharing one land under one sky.